The woman tightened her grip on a worn leather notebook as the ranch gate swung open, and before the towering cowboy could ask a single question, she whispered, "Please, just let me stay." He looked at the notebook once, then quietly stepped aside, but whatever she was protecting seemed powerful enough to put them both in danger. The wind drove snow across the corral, burying fresh hoofprints almost as quickly as they appeared. Rebecca Miles had already decided she would leave before dawn if she wasn't wanted. She asked for work, not mercy. Across the porch stood Wesley Carter, a man whose silence carried farther than most men's shouting. His eyes lingered on the weathered notebook tucked beneath her arm, and something in his expression changed. He never asked what she had run from. He only opened the door wider. Neither of them knew that one small choice would soon force an entire valley to decide what truth was worth protecting. "Before we go on, tell me, would you have opened that door?" The first snowstorm of November came early to western Wyoming. Wind rolled down through Broken Elk Pass with a sound that made pine trees groan and fence posts shiver. By late afternoon, the wagon road had disappeared beneath fresh snow, leaving only faint ruts that vanished every few yards beneath drifting white. Rebecca Miles had stopped counting her steps. She held the worn leather notebook beneath her coat with both arms, protecting it more carefully than she protected herself. Snow had gathered along the hem of her faded brown skirt. One boot had begun to split near the toe, and every step drove cold water deeper inside. Far behind her, the freight wagons were gone. Victor Langley had watched from his saddle, while two hired drivers tossed her carpetbag into the snow. They had kept the clothes, they had kept her wages, they had even taken the horse she had ridden for nearly 8 months. Only one thing remained in her hands: the notebook. She stumbled once, caught herself against a frozen sagebrush, then forced herself forward again. A weathered wooden sign finally emerged through the blowing snow. Crow Ridge Ranch. She almost cried from relief. Smoke drifted from a stone chimney farther up the hill. There was still someone home. By the time she reached the porch, her fingers were so numb she could barely lift them to knock. 3 slow knocks disappeared beneath the wind. Nothing. She leaned against the doorframe and tried again. The latch turned. The door opened only halfway. A man filled nearly the entire doorway. He was the tallest man Rebecca had ever seen. Broad shoulders, heavy canvas coat, dark beard touched with early gray. One hand rested on the frame while the other held a shotgun pointed safely toward the floor. For one startled heartbeat, Rebecca stepped backward. Not because of the gun, because his size blocked the light from inside the house. The man's eyes settled on her face first, then on her bleeding boots, then on the notebook pressed beneath her coat. Without saying a word, he lowered the shotgun, leaned it carefully against the wall inside, and stepped completely away from the doorway. The entrance stood open. "You'd better come in," he said quietly. His voice surprised her. Low, calm, almost gentle. Rebecca remained where she was. The warmth drifting through the doorway felt unreal. Her lips trembled from cold. "Please let me stay." The words barely carried above the wind. "I'll work, I'll cook, I'll clean, I'll do whatever needs doing until the mountain road opens again." The man studied her for another long second. "You don't have to stand out there while we talk." She finally crossed the threshold. Heat from the iron stove wrapped around her aching hands. The room smelled of coffee, pine smoke, saddle leather, and fresh-cut oak. It smelled like people still lived there. The man shut the door against the storm. "My name's Wesley Carter." "Rebecca Miles." He nodded once. No questions followed. No demand to explain why she had arrived alone in the middle of a blizzard. No suspicion spoken aloud. Only silence. A chair stood near the stove. Wesley pulled it closer with one hand. He did not touch her. "You can sit." She lowered herself carefully. her legs shaking so badly the chair creaked beneath her. Another pair of footsteps sounded from the hallway. A teenage boy appeared carrying an armload of split firewood. He stopped immediately. His eyes moved from Rebecca to Wesley. "That's her," he said quietly. Wesley looked up. "The woman Mr. Langley was talking about in town." The boy hesitated. "He said she'd stolen company money." Rebecca looked down at the floorboards. She had expected that. Victor always arrived before the truth did. Wesley set another log into the stove. "It's snowing outside?" Peter blinked. "Yes." "Then we're talking about weather." The boy understood. He stacked the wood without another word. A few minutes later, Wesley disappeared into another room and returned carrying thick wool socks, dry boots, and an old gray coat that had clearly belonged to someone smaller than him. "They'll fit better than what you've got." Rebecca accepted them carefully. "Thank you. You'll find a wash basin through that door." She disappeared into the small room. When she pulled off her boots, fresh blood stained the worn stockings. She washed her feet as quietly as she could. By the time she returned wearing dry socks and borrowed boots, Peter had already set another plate on the table. Supper was simple: beef stew, cornbread, black coffee. No one rushed her. No one watched every bite she took. The silence felt strange, safe. Halfway through the meal, Wesley finally spoke. "Need a doctor?" Rebecca shook her head. "No." She hesitated. "How far is the county land office in Pine Ridge?" Peter looked surprised. Wesley answered without asking why. "About 24 miles, less if the South Trail stays open." "When does it reopen after snow?" "Depends on the mountain." She nodded slowly. That answer made sense. Nothing else was said. After supper, Wesley disappeared into the front room. When he returned, he placed $3 silver beside her coffee cup. "Advance wages." Rebecca stared. "I haven't worked yet." "You will." "I offered to stay for nothing." "I don't hire people for nothing." His tone never changed. Matter of fact, like he was explaining the weather. "You'll have the small room beside the kitchen." She looked at the coins for another long moment before picking them up. Instead of slipping them into her pocket, she opened the leather notebook. The pages were packed with tiny, careful handwriting. Columns, dates, receipts, freight numbers. She turned to a clean corner and wrote slowly, "Debt, Samuel." Her pencil stopped. She frowned, then carefully crossed out the wrong name. Below it she wrote instead, "Advance received from Wesley Carter. $3 silver, every cent accounted for. Even now." When she closed the notebook, Wesley happened to glance toward it. For just an instant, his eyes caught a small triangle drawn beside two faded words, "Blue Cedar Spring." His expression barely changed. But something behind his eyes did. His father had marked water maps with that same triangle. Exactly the same. He said nothing. Outside, snow struck the windows harder. Peter yawned. Wesley carried a lantern down the hallway and opened the door to the small bedroom. "The blankets are clean." Rebecca stood. "Thank you." She paused. "I won't be any trouble." He looked at her as if the thought had never crossed his mind. "I'm not worried about trouble." She stepped into the room, a narrow bed, a washstand, one small window nearly buried beneath snow. When the door closed softly behind her, Wesley walked back into the front room. Peter lowered his voice. "You think she's telling the truth?" "I think she walked here through a blizzard." "That's not what I asked." Wesley looked toward the hallway. "No," he answered honestly. "I don't know." He crossed the room and unlocked a tall pine cabinet. Inside rested ledgers, land deeds, loan papers, survey maps tied with faded blue ribbon. He hesitated only a second before locking it again. The sound of the key turning carried clearly through the quiet house. Down the hallway, Rebecca sat on the edge of the bed. She had heard it. He had given her warmth, food, a room, wages, but not trust. She rested the notebook on her lap and laid one hand across its worn cover. Outside, the storm buried the road leading back toward Broken Elk Pass. Inside Crow Ridge Ranch, another road had only just begun. Rebecca woke before daylight. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then she heard the slow crackle of the kitchen stove and the distant shuffle of cattle outside the barn. She folded the blanket neatly before leaving the room. The gray coat Wesley had loaned her hung on the peg beside the door. She brushed melted snow from its sleeves before putting it on, almost as if it still belonged to someone else. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee. Wesley stood at the stove with his back turned, pouring boiling water through a cloth filter into a black enamel pot. He glanced toward her. "You sleep any?" "A little." He pushed a steaming mug toward her without another word. Peter was already pulling on his gloves. "We've got feeding to do." Rebecca wrapped both hands around the cup before taking the first sip. It was strong enough to wake every tired bone in her body. When they stepped outside, dawn had only begun to color the eastern sky. Snow reached halfway up the fence rails. Every gate had to be forced open with shoulders instead of hands. Rebecca watched Wesley lift a frozen chain from the corral gate. The iron links had frozen solid overnight. He leaned his weight against the post until the ice cracked with a sharp snap. He never hurried, never cursed. He simply kept working. Inside the hay barn, she noticed something before either man spoke. The stack was smaller than it should have been. She counted automatically. 3 rows, 7 bales across, 4 missing near the back wall. Peter tossed another bale toward the feed wagon. "We're gonna be short by February." Rebecca looked at him. "Has anyone counted?" Peter shrugged. "Uncle Wesley already knows." She turned toward Wesley. "Do you?" He nodded once. "I know. But not how long it'll last." He looked at her for a quiet moment. "No." That answer surprised her. Most men she had worked for would rather pretend certainty than admit they were guessing. After breakfast, she wandered through the barn while Wesley repaired a loose hinge. Near the tack room, she found a slate board hanging beside the door. Each day's feed had been marked in chalk. Hay, oats, salt, cattle count. Her eyes stopped. The numbers didn't fit. She walked outside and counted the herd gathered near the south fence. Then she returned to the board. 23 cows had been fed. The chalk record listed 26. 3 animals existed on paper, but nowhere else. She erased nothing, simply stood staring. Peter wandered over, carrying an armload of harness straps. "What? Who keeps this board?" "Usually Uncle Wesley." "Has it always matched the herd?" Peter frowned. "I never checked." Rebecca picked up a piece of chalk. "If 3 cattle disappeared, your feed records would still say they ate." Peter scratched his head. "I guess. And if someone borrowed feed from another stack, you wouldn't notice." She smiled faintly. "Exactly." For the next 2 hours, she cut small squares from an empty flour sack. She wrote numbers on each one with charcoal, then tied them to different haystacks using twine from the supply shelf. Peter watched with growing curiosity. "What are those for?" "So nobody has to guess tomorrow." By noon, every stack carried a numbered tag. Every feed ration had its own mark. Nothing fancy, only simple order. Wesley returned from repairing the north fence and stopped just inside the barn. "What happened in here?" Rebecca dusted flour from her hands. "I'd rather count once than wonder every morning." He walked slowly through the rows, touched one cloth tag, then another. He said nothing. Peter grinned. "I kinda like it." The days settled into a quiet rhythm. Snow, work, coffee, more snow. Rebecca discovered she could be useful without asking permission every hour. She swept the feed room because loose grain attracted mice. She stacked receipts inside empty tobacco tins instead of leaving them beneath coffee cups. She sharpened pencils with Wesley's pocket knife before placing them beside the account book. Small things. Things nobody noticed until they were already making life easier. One evening, Peter dropped a ledger onto the kitchen table. "I don't get this." Rebecca looked down. He had copied livestock numbers from the fall roundup. One figure was wrong, deliberately wrong. She recognized the mistake almost immediately. Instead of correcting him, she slid the pencil back across the table. "Do it again." "I already did." "I know." He sighed dramatically. 20 minutes later, he slapped the table. "There." She checked the page. "Perfect." "What changed?" "I counted twice," she smiled. "So will everybody else after you." Peter looked oddly proud. From the doorway, Wesley had watched the entire exchange without interrupting. Later that night, Rebecca sat beside the stove repairing a cracked saddle strap. The leather had dried from years of Wyoming wind. She rubbed warm tallow into the fibers before stitching. Across from her, Wesley held the strap steady with both hands. His fingers were enormous, awkward around a needle, patient enough to wait for hers. The only sounds came from thread pulling through leather and logs settling inside the stove. Finally, she looked up. "Why are people afraid of you?" He didn't answer right away. The fire reflected softly across his face. "They remember one day I lost my temper." He kept watching the leather. "They don't remember all the days I didn't." Rebecca lowered her eyes again. She believed him. Not because of what he said, because of how carefully he had spent every moment around her since opening that front door. 2 mornings later, the storm finally broke. Bright sunlight spread across untouched snow. Rebecca noticed an old measuring post standing near the edge of the lower pasture. Dark marks climbed the weathered wood every few inches. "What is that?" Peter answered. "Granddad measured snowfall every winter." Rebecca brushed snow away from the lower markings. The highest line from last winter stood several inches lower than this year's. She frowned. They climbed toward the old irrigation ditch after dinner. The channel should have carried meltwater toward the south pasture. Instead, much of it lay dry beneath fresh snow. Farther uphill, Rebecca knelt beside a survey stake. The wood looked newer than everything around it. Fresh axe marks, fresh dirt. Wheel tracks frozen beneath drifting snow. Someone had been there after the first freeze. She reached toward the stake. A loud crack echoed beneath her boots. The ground shifted. "Rebecca!" Before she could move, Wesley crossed the distance in 3 strides. He caught Peter by the coat collar and pulled him backward just as the snow collapsed into a narrow hollow beneath the trail. Ice shattered below. Cold water rushed through darkness. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Wesley's breathing remained steady. His voice did not. "You don't know these mountains well enough to bring that boy up here." Rebecca looked from the broken ground to the survey stake. "I know enough to see somebody stealing your water while you're keeping your papers locked away from the one person trying to read them." Silence. Only wind across the ridge. Back at the ranch, Wesley handed her the key to her room. "You don't leave this place again unless somebody goes with you." Rebecca stared at the small brass key, then quietly placed it on the kitchen table. "I didn't survive one man deciding where I could go just to trade him for another." The words landed harder than either of them expected. Peter looked between them but wisely disappeared into the barn. Wesley remained standing beside the table for a very long time. Finally, he picked up the key. He slid it gently back toward her. "You're right." His voice was quieter than before. "I don't have the right to tell you that." Rebecca took the key. Neither apologized. Neither needed to. That night, after the house had fallen silent, she opened the leather notebook beneath the lantern. She turned to the pages she had checked hundreds of times before. Then her breathing stopped. One page was gone, not torn, carefully cut from the binding with a sharp blade. It was the page that listed the payment made to the man who moved the survey marker. Rebecca slowly closed the notebook. Only 3 people had been inside Crow Ridge long enough to touch it. Wesley, Peter, or herself. She stared toward the dark hallway. For the first time since the blizzard, uncertainty returned with the night. By morning, Rebecca had said nothing. She closed the notebook, tied it with its leather cord, and kept it beneath her coat while she worked. Peter noticed. Wesley did too. Neither asked. 3 nights later, the wind came down from Aspen Ridge hard enough to lift loose shingles from the north barn. The first crack woke the whole house. Wesley was out the door before Rebecca had pulled on her boots. By the time she reached the yard, one section of the hay shed roof had folded inward, leaving the upper stack exposed to blowing snow. Peter dragged a roll of canvas from the tool room. 2 neighbors from the Foster place arrived before sunrise with ropes and a wagon lantern. Wesley climbed the side ladder and braced himself beneath the broken crossbeam. The timber bowed across his shoulder. "Get the canvas over!" he called. His voice carried through the wind without panic. Daniel Foster and Peter hauled the tarp, while Rebecca tied down the lower corners. Wesley held the beam until the last rope was fixed, then lowered it inch by inch rather than letting it fall across the hay. When he came down, snow clung to his beard, and one sleeve had torn at the elbow. Rebecca looked at the damaged stack. "How much got wet?" "Too much," Peter said. She counted the dry bales again. Then she counted the cattle. By noon, the kitchen table had disappeared beneath chalk marks, feed receipts, and small stacks of beans she used to represent the herd. Wesley stood near the stove, arms folded. Rebecca moved 21 beans away from the main group. "These go to market." Peter stared. "That many? If you wait until the road closes again, buyers will know you have no choice. They'll take the whole herd for half what it's worth." Wesley looked at the beans. "Which 21? The weak cows, the late breeders, not the heifers." He did not answer immediately. Those animals carried years of work in their brands. Rebecca waited. Finally he said, "Mark them." The next problem was the roof. Daniel Foster had milled lumber stacked beside his south shed, but needed 2 weeks of fence work before spring. Rebecca rode to his ranch with Wesley. The road was packed snow over frozen ruts. She sat stiff in the saddle, trying not to show how badly the cold pulled at her legs. Wesley noticed anyway. At the first creek crossing, he dismounted and shortened her stirrups by 1 hole. He did it without touching her boot. "That better?" She tested the length. "Yes." He nodded and mounted again. At Foster's table, Rebecca laid out the agreement plainly. 2 weeks of Wesley and Peter's labor in exchange for roof boards, nails, and the use of Foster's wagon. Daniel scratched his beard. "Sounds fair." Wesley looked at Rebecca instead of answering for her. She slid the paper across the table. "Then sign here." By the end of the week, Crow Ridge had a new roof and 21 cattle ready for sale. The trip to Coldwater Junction came under a pale sky. Snowbanks lined the main street. Smoke drifted from the blacksmith's chimney. Sleigh runners hissed over packed ice in front of Louise Harper's boarding house. Rebecca carried the Crow Ridge ledger beneath one arm. The leather notebook remained hidden under her coat. Howard Bell sat behind a walnut desk at the bank, spectacles low on his nose. He frowned when Rebecca pointed to the interest column. This figure was added twice. Howard leaned closer. It was carried forward. "No." Rebecca turned the page. It was charged in March, then entered again in June under a different receipt number. The room went still. Howard's clerk stopped sharpening his pencil. Wesley stood beside Rebecca, his hat in both hands. Howard looked at him. "Since when does she speak for Crow Ridge?" Wesley answered without raising his voice. "Miss Miles keeps Crow Ridge's books." Rebecca did not look at him, but her fingers loosened around the ledger. Howard corrected the entry. Then he tapped the mortgage paper. Doesn't change the final date, 1st of June. We know, Rebecca said. They had barely stepped onto the boardwalk when Victor Langley crossed the street. He wore a dark wool coat, clean gloves, and the expression of a man arriving exactly where he intended to be. 2 freight drivers followed him. Sheriff Milton Price came out of the marshal's office holding a folded paper. Miss Miles. Rebecca stopped. Victor smiled. She took company funds and private records when she left my service. I was put off your wagon at Broken Elk Pass. You were dismissed. Victor handed the sheriff a signed statement, then another page. This contract says all records created during her employment belong to Langley Freight. Rebecca took one look and recognized the seal. Howard Bell's bank had witnessed it. Sheriff Price shifted his weight. I'll need the notebook. Wesley stepped forward. Rebecca lifted one hand. He stopped. The sheriff saw it. So did Victor. Rebecca met Milton's eyes. You may have it under inventory. What does that mean? Every page numbered, every mark copied. Mrs. Harper and Attorney Whitaker present when it is sealed. Victor's smile faded. That's unnecessary. It is, if the book matters. Louise Harper had come to the boarding house doorway with a flower cloth still over one shoulder. George Whitaker stood beside her, coat unbuttoned, already listening. Sheriff Price looked from one witness to the other, then nodded. We'll do it her way. Inside the marshal's office, each page was counted. Each torn edge was recorded. Rebecca watched until the leather cover was wrapped in brown paper and tied with red string. When she stepped outside, a man near the general store leaned against the porch rail. So that's the woman Carter picked up to keep his house. A few men looked away. Wesley stopped in the street. The man straightened when Wesley turned toward him. Everyone in Coldwater Junction knew how large Wesley Carter was. They knew the stories, too. Wesley walked to the porch. His fists tightened once, then opened. She doesn't keep my house, he said. She's keeping half this valley from losing land while the rest of you are too proud to read what's put in front of you. Victor gave a soft laugh. Careful, Carter. Your brother learned what happens when you lose your temper. Wesley's jaw hardened. Rebecca watched the muscles in his hand draw tight against the brim of his hat. He did not move. Not one step. The silence lasted until Victor looked away first. That evening, Wesley worked on the porch after supper. Rebecca heard the saw through the kitchen wall. By lamplight, he cut pine boards, measured twice, and drove each nail straight. Before bed, he carried a second chair onto the porch and placed it beside the old one. He did not call her outside. He did not explain. The next morning, Rebecca found the chair dusted with fine saw shavings. She stood beside it for a long moment, then leaned against the porch rail instead. 2 days later, George Whitaker arrived on horseback. He carried a copied page from the sealed notebook. Wesley let him in. George spread the paper across the kitchen table and pointed to a signature beside the record of a payment made near Blue Cedar Spring. I checked the county files. Peter came closer. Wesley did not. George looked directly at him. The name belongs to Andrew Carter. The room changed. Peter's face went pale. Rebecca looked at Wesley. He stood very still, one hand resting on the back of the empty second chair. If the record was true, Andrew had not merely known about the stolen water. He might have been the man Victor paid to steal it. Wesley took his hand from the chair. For a moment he seemed too large for the kitchen, not because he moved, but because every board and wall had gone still around him. Peter stared at the copied signature. That's my father's name. George Whitaker folded his spectacles and placed them on the table. It appears on a freight payment dated 6 years ago. $75. Same week the spring marker was moved. Rebecca looked at the entry again. The ink beside Andrew's name was darker than the rest. The payment had no notation, no word for wages, no word for sale, only a name and an amount. "That doesn't prove what the money was for," she said. George nodded. "No, but Victor will say it does." Peter pushed away from the table. "My father wouldn't sell the spring." Nobody answered quickly enough. The boy read that silence for himself and walked out into the yard. Wesley watched the door close. Then he picked up his coat. Rebecca followed him to the barn. He stood inside the horse stall with one hand resting on the partition. A bay mare breathed softly beside him. "Andrew owed money," he said. His eyes remained on the straw. "Cards, horses, a little here, a little there. He always said he'd make it back." Rebecca said nothing. One winter he came home talking about survey stakes. Said Langley had men moving them above Blue Cedar. I thought he was trying to hide another debt. Wesley's fingers tightened against the wood. "He told me I never listened. I told him he wasn't worth listening to." The mare shifted. Wesley lowered his voice. "He tried to leave that night. I stood in the doorway." Rebecca could see the memory in the way his shoulders held. "I caught his coat, put him against the wall. He swallowed once. Didn't strike him, didn't need to. He knew I could." The barn remained quiet except for the mare chewing hay. "He left the next morning," Wesley said. "Peter was 10. Andrew never came back." Rebecca looked at his hands, hands that could hold a broken roof beam, hands that waited for permission before touching hers. "The town says you nearly killed him. I never corrected them." "Why?" His eyes finally lifted. "Because he left afraid of me. The rest didn't seem worth arguing over." Rebecca understood then why Wesley stepped back from every doorway, why he lowered his voice when anger would have been easier, why he treated restraint like work that had to be done every day. That evening, Peter came in after dark. His coat was wet at the shoulders. Mud clung to his boots. He stood near the stove and looked at Rebecca. "I took the page." Wesley turned slowly. Peter's chin trembled, but he held it up. "I saw Pa's name. I thought you'd use it against him." "Where is it?" Rebecca asked. "Old Pine Survey Cabin." Wesley's jaw tightened. Peter hurried on. "I wrapped it in oilcloth, hid it under the loose floorboard." Rebecca opened the copied ledger page. "What exactly did you see?" $75 from Langley. Pa's name. That was enough." "No," she said. "It was enough to frighten you, not enough to prove anything." Peter's eyes dropped. Rebecca pointed to the ink. "This amount was written later, and there's no mark beside it saying wages or sale." Wesley looked at her. "You noticed that before?" "Yes." "Why didn't you say?" "Because facts should be ready before accusations are." The words landed between all three of them. 2 days later, George returned with papers. He found Wesley beside the corral and handed him a folded deed. Rebecca saw her own name on the front line before either man noticed her. 20 acres along the southern boundary, transferred from Wesley Carter to Rebecca Miles. She carried the deed into the kitchen. Wesley followed. "I was going to tell you." "When?" "After George filed it." She laid the paper flat on the table. "You decided I was staying before asking whether I wanted to. I decided you should have land Victor couldn't take. A gift stops being kindness when it makes the choice for the person receiving it." His face changed. Not anger. Recognition. "I know what you thought." Rebecca's voice stayed level. "That is the trouble." She took a letter from her pocket and set it beside the deed. Louise Harper had written that 3 ranchers in Coldwater Junction wanted Rebecca to keep their books. A furnished room above the boarding house would be available in March. "I can support myself in town." Wesley looked at the letter. "When the South Road opens," she said, "I'm leaving." Peter moved near the doorway, but stopped when Wesley raised one hand. Not to silence Rebecca, to keep the boy from interrupting. Wesley stood there for a long moment. Then he nodded. The next morning, Rebecca found the gentlest mare saddled by the gate. Wesley had shortened the stirrups to fit her. I'll take you to town, he said. If you don't want me along, Peter will. Rebecca looked at him. He had done the hardest thing his size never helped him do. He had stepped aside. The thaw began 3 days later. Water dripped from the eaves. Snow softened along the south fence. The creek rose beneath a shell of ice. Peter disappeared before breakfast. His bed was empty. One saddle was gone. Wesley found the tracks leading toward Aspen Ridge. He went for the page. Rebecca was already pulling on her coat. The mountain road had turned to mud beneath the snow. Halfway up the ridge, a fallen pine blocked the trail. Wesley dismounted and rolled the trunk far enough for the horses to pass. Rebecca moved ahead on foot, watching for Peter's prints where they crossed exposed stone. Near Miller's Cut, she stopped suddenly. A faint sound moved beneath the snow. Running water. She caught Wesley's sleeve before he stepped forward. Wait. He looked down. The crust beneath his next step sagged. They circled wide and found the trail again near a line of broken brush. By late afternoon, they saw the survey cabin. One corner had settled into the slope. The door hung crooked. Peter lay inside beside the stove, his ankle wrapped in a torn shirt. I'm fine, he said too quickly. Wesley knelt. The cabin floor groaned beneath his weight, but his hands were careful around the swollen joint. Rebecca found the oilcloth beneath the loose board. Inside was the missing page. Dusk closed over the ridge before they could leave. Wesley built a small fire. Peter slept beneath 2 blankets, while wind moved through the cabin seams. Rebecca sat across from Wesley. The torn page rested between them. I don't know how to need someone, he said. Without worrying, I'll turn it into a lock. Rebecca looked toward the crooked door. Then don't lock it. He waited. Let them walk in on their own. His eyes stayed on her. Why did you come after Peter if you're leaving? She folded the edge of the blanket across her knees. Leaving a place doesn't mean I stop caring about the people in it. The fire settled lower. Neither of them spoke again. Near midnight, Rebecca turned the page over. There was writing on the back. Andrew's hand, small and hurried. Money received as evidence. Marker moved 412 yards east. Beneath the sentence stood a survey mark, a narrow triangle crossed by 2 lines. Rebecca's breath caught. My father used that mark. Wesley leaned closer. She touched the faded symbol with one finger. He worked temporary survey crews out of Kansas before I was born. The page named another man beside Andrew Carter, Miles, her father's family name. For years, Andrew and Rebecca's father had carried different halves of the same truth. The torn page proved the marker had been moved. Her notebook proved Victor had paid for it. But one thing was still missing, the original survey map. Without it, Victor could still call every word on the page a lie. 6 days remained before the land hearing in Pine Ridge, and when Rebecca looked through the cabin window toward the dark mountain road, she knew the choice before her had changed. She could leave Crow Ridge as planned, or stay long enough to fight for land that had never belonged to her. Rebecca made her decision before sunrise. Wesley was saddling the horses when she stepped from the survey cabin with the torn page tucked inside her coat. I'm going to Pine Ridge, she said. He looked at her across the gray morning. For Crow Ridge. For every name in Victor's book. That was all. They brought Peter home first. His ankle was badly swollen but not broken. Louise Harper arranged a room for him at her boarding house while the town doctor wrapped the joint and ordered him off it for a week. The hearing was set for Thursday morning. Pine Ridge stood 30 miles south of Coldwater Junction, beyond a low stretch of sage and 2 creek crossings that turned muddy during the thaw. Wesley drove the wagon. Rebecca sat beside him with the sealed notebook beneath her feet and the torn page hidden in her glove. Neither spoke much. The farther south they traveled, the wider the road became. By noon, other wagons had joined them. Daniel Foster came with his land receipts. 2 ranchers from the Blue Cedar line rode behind. Louise traveled in a covered buggy with George Whitaker. What had begun as one woman's stolen wages now followed the road like a gathering storm. The county land office was a narrow brick building beside the courthouse. Inside, the air smelled of wet wool, lamp oil, and dust warmed by the stove. Victor Langley sat at the front table in a dark coat. Howard Bell was beside him. Sheriff Milton Price stood near the clerk with the sealed notebook under one arm. Wesley took a place behind Rebecca. Not beside her, not in front. Close enough if she needed him. Far enough that no one could say he spoke for her. The land officer adjusted his spectacles. "Miss Miles, you claim the Blue Cedar Spring filings were altered?" "I claim the freight records show a pattern." Victor leaned back. "This woman stole private company documents." Rebecca did not look at him. Sheriff Price laid the notebook on the table. The red string was still tied, the wax seal unbroken. George Whitaker checked every mark before the package was opened. 1 page at a time, Rebecca explained the entries. Wages deducted, but never paid. Freight runs billed twice. Supply wagons listed on days when no wagons had crossed the North Road. Loans purchased by Victor within weeks of each ranch losing water. She laid the Crow Ridge snow records beside the spring figures. "This post shows a heavier winter than the year before," she said. "Yet the water dropped by nearly half. Snow does not vanish from one side of a ridge and leave wagon tracks behind." The land officer studied the columns. Victor folded his hands. "She has no survey license." "No," Rebecca said. "She was dismissed for theft. I was left at Broken Elk Pass without wages. She has been living under Mr. Carter's roof." Several men shifted in their chairs. Rebecca rested one hand on the notebook. "The numbers do not change because of where the person writing them sleeps." The room went quiet. Even Victor stopped smiling. George presented the torn page. Andrew Carter's name. The $75 payment. The note written on the back. Marker moved 412 yards east. The land officer frowned. "A private notation is not an official survey." George placed a copy of the county map beside it. "The marks correspond." "Correspondence is not proof." Victor's lawyer rose. "There is no original map. No living surveyor. No witness to the alleged movement." Rebecca felt the room tighten. For months, she had carried every line, every receipt, every number. And still the truth might lose because the right piece of paper had not survived. The land officer removed his spectacles. "Without an original survey, I cannot set aside a notarized water filing." Victor glanced toward Howard Bell. The banker lowered his eyes. Wesley did not move. Rebecca looked back once. His face held no promise he could not keep, only presence. The clerk reached for the papers. Then the rear door opened. Louise Harper entered with an older man at her side. He carried a dented tin map tube beneath one arm. His coat was faded nearly white at the shoulders. One hand shook around the tube. "Name's Benjamin Porter," he said. Victor rose. "You have no business here." Benjamin stopped in the center aisle. "That's what you told me 6 years ago." Sheriff Price stepped between them. Benjamin handed the tube to the land officer. "Andrew Carter left this at Harper's place. Told me to keep it until somebody came carrying the Miles survey mark." Rebecca stared at him. Benjamin looked ashamed. "I should have brought it forward sooner." He swallowed. "I had children to feed. Langley had work to give or take." Louise stood beside without touching him. "He heard what happened at Broken Elk Pass," she said. "That was enough." The land officer opened the tube. The map inside was brittle at the folds but intact. Blue Cedar Spring was marked in blue pencil. 3 ranch boundaries ran from it: Crow Ridge, Foster Land, the smaller spread east of the wash. At the bottom were 2 witness marks: Andrew Carter and Rebecca's father, the same crossed triangle from her notebook. The hearing changed after that. Not quickly, not dramatically. The way official things often changed. Clerks compared signatures. The sheriff took new statements. Howard Bell was required to produce mortgage records. Victor's notarized filing was suspended pending investigation into altered boundaries, false freight charges, and unpaid wages. By late afternoon, the land officer restored the original water claim. Crow Ridge had not been saved by Wesley's strength. It had been saved by a woman who refused to let one line of ink disappear. Outside the building, ranchers gathered on the boardwalk. One of them looked toward Wesley. "She coming back to keep Crow Ridge's books?" Wesley set his hat on his head. "That's for Miss Miles to decide." Rebecca heard him. She did not turn. 2 weeks later, Victor's company paid the wages it had withheld. The Foster brothers offered Rebecca a monthly account contract. 2 other ranchers did the same. Louise had a furnished room ready above the boarding house. Rebecca could afford it. For the first time in years, she had choices that did not depend on mercy. She returned to Crow Ridge in late March to collect her belongings. The snow had pulled back from the south pasture. Water ran beneath the ditch boards in a thin, clear stream. Wesley had already loaded her carpetbag into the wagon. The gray coat lay folded on top. The second chair still stood on the porch. A light layer of dust covered the seat. Rebecca stopped beside it. "The day I came here, I asked to stay because I had nowhere else to go." Wesley held the reins loosely. "I remember. Now I do." His gaze dropped to the leather in his hands. "I know." She lifted the carpetbag from the wagon, then carried it back to the porch. Wesley looked up. "Coldwater Junction is not where I want to build my life." For the first time, hope made him look uncertain. He reached inside his coat and brought out 2 folded papers. One was a partnership agreement for Crow Ridge. The other allowed Rebecca to open her bookkeeping office in the front room of the ranch house. Both signature lines were blank. "I thought I was waiting for someone who could help me hold this place together," he said. He looked at her directly. "I was wrong." He did not step closer. "You're the woman I've been waiting for. Not because you needed me, because you saw me clearly and stayed long enough to make your own choice." Rebecca carried the papers to the porch rail. She read every line. Then she signed the partnership first. Wesley watched the pen move. She set it down. "What about the thing you did not put on paper?" His hand tightened once around his hat. "I want to marry you." He paused. "But I won't ask until you know you can say no." Rebecca stepped toward him. She placed her hand over the one holding his hat. "Then you can ask now." His voice was almost too quiet to hear. "Rebecca Miles, will you marry me?" "Yes." One word. Steady. Chosen. By late summer, Blue Cedar Spring ran clear through the repaired ditch. Peter kept the cattle count in a new ledger. Rebecca's office occupied the front room, where Wesley once kept locked files. The cabinet doors now stood open. On warm evenings, Wesley returned from the fence line and ducked beneath the low doorway. Rebecca finished her accounts, closed the book, and carried 2 cups of coffee outside. The second chair was no longer empty. She sat beside him. He waited. Rebecca placed her hand on the wooden arm between them. Only then did Wesley cover it with his own. His touch was lighter than anyone looking at him would have expected. The first time Rebecca came to Crow Ridge, she begged to stay because the storm had closed every road behind her. When summer returned, every road stood open, and she still chose the man who had never locked a door to keep her there. Maybe that was the quiet truth Crow Ridge had been waiting to learn all along. The strongest thing Wesley Carter ever built was never a fence, a barn, or a water line. It was a place where another person could stand with her own name, her own work, and her own future. And Rebecca Miles never stayed because she had nowhere else to go. She stayed because after every hard mile, every difficult choice, and every chance to walk away, she found someone who respected the freedom to choose. The West was filled with people chasing land, water, and fortune. But the things that lasted were often much smaller. A chair left empty until someone was ready to sit beside you. A worn notebook that carried the truth long enough for justice to catch up. A hand that waited instead of reaching first. Perhaps that is what love looks like when it is honest. Not holding on tighter, but giving someone enough room to stay by choice. If you had been in Rebecca's place, would you have left for a new life in town? Or would you have returned to Crow Ridge? If this story stayed with you after the final page, I hope you'll join me again. There are more journeys waiting beyond the next trail. Stories of quiet courage, healing hearts, and the unexpected people who remind us that home is sometimes found only after we've had every chance to leave.